All right. Hello, everybody. Oh, that's right. I don't need that. Welcome to the Lucasfilm Games Postmortem. This is the first company postmortem that GDC has done, and I'm really happy that they've given us this privilege. As a few more people are filtering in, let me just ask a few questions in the audience there. Well, first of all, I'm Noah Falstein. I'm going to be our moderator today, and we've got a distinguished panel of 5 of the very first people who were at Lucasfilm Games that later became LucasArts Entertainment. And this all came about pretty much last year around this time. LucasArts was sold off to Disney. And for a lot of us who were there in the early years, it was a really poignant moment and got us reflecting a lot. And we've had many requests for interviews and done some panels and things. And we were having a great time reminiscing, but also wondering questions about things like what was it that made it so special at the time, and could that be recreated? And that seemed like a good basis for a talk here at GDC, which is really what brought us here. But before we begin, I'm just curious about a few things. First of all, how many of you have played some of the old Lucasfilm Games, LucasArts? Okay, thank you very much. And I have to say, when we were making these things, and you told us that, 30, 35 years later, people would still be playing those old games, it would have been pretty hard to believe. How many people actually, this is the thing, now if all the same hands go up, this is going to be a little bit daunting. How many people actually worked at LucasArts at one time or another who are in this audience? Okay, not quite so many. All right, there we go. What do you know? People besides our company actually played our games. Good work. All right, so let's get going here. First, I'm going to give some intros, and each person's going to tell you a little bit about their perspective and background. We're going to begin here with a little video, and I don't often put video in my slides, so I'm hoping everything's going to work here. There you go, a little play from BallBlazer, one of our first 2 games. And to talk about that, and more importantly about his role in being the person who started up the company and got everybody underway, is Peter Langston, who I've got some reasonably embarrassing pictures of most of us. So Peter, why don't you tell people a little bit about what it was like to get things started, what some of the hurdles you went through as you went through that process.
Yeah. Okay, well, I wrote my first computer game in 1965, I think. And being a computer professional, systems analyst, and college teacher, I continued writing games throughout until about, say, 1982, when I was pretty well known, especially among the Unix community, that's UNIX community, and for games. And probably the best known of the games was a multiplayer global simulation game called Empire, which caused a few people to drop out of school because they just didn't have enough time for studies also. And in 1982, in April of 1982, I got a call from George Lucas's people asking if I'd be interested in starting a new enterprise for him outside the film business. Now, the background for that is that the movie business, you spend a lot of money for 3 or 4 years, and then suddenly over maybe a 2-week period, millions and millions of dollars come flooding in. And they'll go right back out as tax unless you find a use for them that would be a good expense. And a lot of movie companies just bought land or something. But George really invested it in the business. And when the proceeds from Empire Strikes Back came in, he formed the computer division, which out of which later came things like Pixar, Edit Droid, Sonic Solutions, DroidWorks. when the next movie, Revenge of the Jedi, which then had to become Return of the Jedi for political reasons, came in, needed to expand further in some direction and took the first step outside the movie business, but the idea being to do sort of modern technology in the entertainment industry outside of the films. And the assumption was that that would probably be games, but we needed to kind of determine that. The job was offered to a number of people, a number of graphics hotshots, and they all turned it down because although it sounded like a lot of fun, it wasn't real work. It was just kind of playing around, and there wouldn't be any real future in it, and how would it look on a resume? And I didn't have these compunctions, so when it was offered to me, I took the job. And my goals, I think, were to use modern technology in the games business. To be fair, console games at that point were pretty basic, pretty crude. The graphics were blocky and aliased. Music was whiny and repetitive. Game physics was awkward at best. And the games had to run on machines like the Atari 2600, which was a 6502 processor with 128 bytes of RAM. Now, 128 bytes. It was interesting because most of the people in the business at that point didn't think of it as 128 bytes. They thought of it as 1,024 bits, because you wouldn't use a whole byte if you only needed like 7 bits. And so we came in with kind of more of a tools approach. We used larger computers to model and to compile programs to run on the 6502s and other small computers. And so I hired computer professionals who had a kind of a tools approach and had an aptitude for using various computer languages, ability to create computer languages when needed. Of course, we took advantage of the experts right next door in storytelling, computing, graphics, sound, editing. And I wanted to create an environment that specifically allowed and then encouraged creativity rather than making marketing deadlines. As it happened, just by coincidence, our marketing deadlines kept falling away by other people's problems, and to the point where we were begging for people to release our things, which is probably a first. And I tried to manage the group as a group of peers, so that when David Fox came to me with a great game idea, and I told him, "Oh, that'll never work," he was in a perfect position to ignore me and go ahead, put that in the game, and it ended up being like one of the most memorable parts of the game. And I'm glad that that was the situation. I would have felt terrible if he had not done it and we'd lost that. We took in $1 million our first year. We didn't actually make any products the first year. We made tools, and I think that really worked out well for us. To test the tools and our development concepts, we made 2 throwaway games, and those throwaway games, I think partly because of the environment we'd already set up, ended up doing things that no games had done before. In one game, we had music being composed on the fly and played on the fly, music that told you what was going on in the game in places where you couldn't see. And at the same time, we had anti-alias graphics being generated in real time on a 6502 processor. We had one magazine interviewer come to interview us, and while we were demoing the game, he started looking under the table in the closet saying, "Okay, where's the video disc player?" I said, no, we're generating it here. He said, no, you can't do that. So the I think that approach already got us off on a good start. And those games, of course, became BallBlazer and Rescue on Fractalus.
And speaking of which, let's take a quick look at Rescue. And my apologies, by the way, it is purely my lack of technical skill and lack of time and preparation that I think some of the bottoms of these videos are cut off. All right, one of the more memorable moments there.
That'll never work.
So I've got a picture here. You see David here in the center and Peter next to him, and other members of our group that couldn't make it or couldn't fit on the stage. But this was the games group, in fact, just as I joined, so this is what I remember of the guys that I first met there. And David was my first contact. He was really the dad of the group in the sense that he actually, had a family, and that was an odd thing for all of us 20-somethings. David, why don't you talk a little bit about making those first games, in particular, I mean, it's not apparent now, as Peter says, it was just shocking to see this sort of 3D first-person point of view that it's so commonplace now that none of us had ever seen before, none of us thought was possible on a computer like that. And how did you get that in there, and what were your thoughts?
Right. Well, going back just a bit before that, I was working on a book called Computer Animation Primer, and as part of the research, I was able to connect with the Lucasfilm computer division and hang around with a bunch of those brilliant guys, including Loren Carpenter, who was known at the time for doing, Fractals, and he's the one standing with a checkered shirt right behind me. And he did the Fractalus for the Genesis effect on the Star Trek II movie, where you see the planet being terraformed. And a year later, when my book was completed, I happened to hear that this new group was starting up, a games group within Lucasfilm. And being in the neighborhood and having already met Ed Catmull and a bunch of other people, I called him up right away and I said, yeah, well, we're about to hire this guy, Peter, and as soon as he comes on board, we'll let him interview you. I brought my manuscript, completed manuscript to show him, and because I was working with the Atari computer, and we were going to be doing Atari games, that was a really great lead-in for me getting the job. So I was the second person hired, third person in the group. There's another person already in the company. I guess the first game designer, and other than Peter. They didn't have our space set up yet, so I was put in an office with Loren, and I, right in the beginning, I asked him, said, hey, is there any chance that we could do a fractal-based first-person game on an Atari 800? And he said, no, are you kidding? And I guess I sparked some interest, and he came back the next morning and said, well, there actually might be a way to do it. And we loaned him an Atari. He learned 6502 like overnight, came back in a day or two with a working demo, and that became the basis for the game. So I had to, then immediately put a game around this landscape. I wanted it to be a Star Wars game originally, and we were told right up front when I asked that we were not allowed to do Star Wars titles, and I was really upset. I joined the company because I wanted to be in Star Wars, and that was the closest way I could do it, was to create a game and then do it that way. But I quickly had to change the concept, and when we finally showed this to George, I think in the summer, we both got about 20 minutes to sit with him while we gave a demo, me and Dave Levine for BallBlazer, and one of the things he noticed was that I didn't have a fire button in the game because I wanted to make this a really, peace-loving game and didn't want to kill anyone. And the way you were supposed to kill people was by getting them to follow you and then make sharp turns and have them crash into the mountains. And, he said, no, give me a fire button. And the other thing he suggested was, adding some tension to the game by possibly having some of the pilots you pick up be the aliens that you're trying to destroy. And first we thought it wasn't going to be doable, and then we thought about it for a while and came up with this concept of having the Jaggi monster pop up and start smashing the screen like you just saw. And we were really lucky in that Atari listened to our marketing request and did not say anything or put any pictures of that in any of their press. And we kept it a surprise. And the thing didn't happen until you were on level 8. And we had, other than back in the manual where there was a transcript of a pilot who's screaming and stuff when she's getting smashed and eaten, we kept it a secret. And I still get letters from people remembering the first time this Jaggi monster popped up. I mean, they've been playing the game casually for 8 levels, and all of a sudden this thing happens, and people would fall out of their seats. There's a kid who ran out of the house screaming, "There's a monster in my computer." I heard people at college in the dark with their sound turned up really loud. They literally would crash, and people would run in and say, scream and crash off of their chair, and people would run and say, "Are you okay? Are you okay?" So it's, I guess, the first game that really scared people, not just made them jump, and that was a lot of fun. So.
Yeah, now it actually probably scares people more when they see a paywall in their game. But all right, well, the next video I have is kind of a 2-for-1. Going to introduce both of our next 2 guests, partly because there's a lot of people have seen the old games, but there's one that hasn't gotten a lot of publicity, and you'll see how that was presented to our company. We would get all of Lucasfilm together once a year, and I have to set the stage a bit in that here we get a company meeting where each of the different groups and divisions in the company shows what they've been up to in the last year, and invariably ILM would go before us and show the best 5 minutes of all their special effects that they had done for the biggest blockbusters, full screen, and then we would project in 1980s technology, so it was like a tiny little portion of the screen would get this little projection of our computer screen stuff with our little Jaggis, and it was kind of humiliating at the time. But we were interactive, and we were also able to show people a little glimpse of the future of hey, computer games may actually get a little bigger sometimes. So you'll listen for the numbers quoted in this video here.
Hi there, I'm Steve Arnold, talking to you live from a popular nightclub in Habitat, a fantasy world made possible by the miracle of telecommunications. Habitat will connect people from all over the country into a single imaginary cartoon reality using a Commodore 64 computer, a modem, and a telephone. Habitat, which could be the world's first 10,000-player computer game, is currently in the final testing stages and will be available later this year. Now let me show you what else we've been up to. One of the products we shipped last year was a game based on the movie Labyrinth. The player must traverse the labyrinth within 13 hours, solving puzzles and avoiding goblins to confront Jareth in the center of his castle or be doomed for eternity as one of Jareth's slaves. Well, it's almost like the movie. The other new game we shipped last year was PHM Pegasus, a high-speed strategy action game that puts the player in command of a military hydrofoil in 8 scenarios around the world. This is our first entry into the popular simulation category of games. We've been very happy with the success of Pegasus, So we are developing a new scenario disc as a separate product that will provide 10 additional adventures for the Pegasus player. Maniac Mansion, a new kind of comedy adventure game, is scheduled to be on the shelves this fall. You direct a trio of teenagers in the exploration of a Victorian mansion, trying to rescue a friend who is being held captive. To save her, you must outwit a crazy doctor who is scheming to take over the world, one teenager at a time. Maniac Mansion is the first game we've published ourselves. And we're already hard at work on some other exciting projects in education and entertainment that we'll be able to show you next year. Let's get a candid reaction to all this. Here's a man standing in front of Habitat's Oracle Fountain. Excuse me, sir, what do you think?
It's great.
We'll hear more about Habitat in a bit, but we're going to now switch over to Steve, who came in, and Steve had been working at Atari, which obviously was a good background. I should say, when I was hired at the company, I was the first game developer they brought in who actually had experience in the game industry before, and that was a big count against me. They felt that, in 1984, I was probably too set in my ways of the old way of doing video games, and we needed something new. But Steve's Atari background to help run the company was helpful. I personally also think one of the major factors that helped out is that before he did that, he was a practicing child psychologist and managing a group of game developers. I can think of very few training regimens that are better than that. But now Steve has gone on to do quite a bit of stuff. Is with VP at Microsoft, but has been a venture capitalist for some time and working with a lot of startups. So he's in a great position to talk about what it was like when we were starting up as this small company within a bigger company, and also some perspective on what that's like in today's world. So, Steve?
So you probably gathered that the joke with George was that when we were presenting to him, that was frequently the reaction you got. He would look at something and he'd consider it very deeply, and then he'd say, great, and that was it. But getting a great was a good outcome when you were presenting to George. So anyway, it was fun to see that old stuff, because I haven't seen that in ages. Let me take a couple of perspectives on the question that Noah asked, which is, what was it about Lucasfilm Games that might have gave us an opportunity to do some innovative stuff? And I guess I've reflected on it a little bit and thought it's probably a combination of the background at Atari and psychology, but there were a couple of other principles that I think we adopted, one of which Peter alluded to earlier, which was we were creating a culture that was designed around innovation. And I think David and I have come to agree, although he was disappointed at the beginning. I actually think one of the really good constraints we had is that we were not working with Star Wars. We had the brand of Star Wars and the credibility of Star Wars and the franchise of Star Wars, but we didn't have to play in that universe. So what happened is we were a group that lived inside of a super creative, technologically astute company, and we got to do our own invention. We got to do our own creation. We were literally probably the only group outside of George inside of the Lucasfilm company that actually got to make up new stories and call them Lucasfilm. And so that gave us a fair amount of freedom and a fair amount of flexibility, and also a fair amount of challenge. But I think that really helped us. I would argue that that helped us. Another thing that happened, and this is a little bit amusing reflecting on it many years later, but I was brought in as the general manager of the group with the idea of trying to figure out how we were going to go from a research group to a development group, a publishing group, without losing the kernels of creativity and innovation that was started by Peter and David and of several other members of the team who aren't here. When I first met with George and I got hired by the computer division folks, and I met with George, he said to me, he said, stay small, be the best, and don't lose any money. Now the good news about that sounds a little mundane at one level, but the good news about that was actually an incredibly liberating mandate, because it really gave us permission, and we didn't actually stay small completely, but we stayed pretty small for a while. But we were really driving towards trying to figure out how could we take the franchise that people were associating with George and Lucasfilm, which was innovative storytelling, apply it to this new interactive world. And so we invented lots of different things because we had permission to do that. I'll throw in one other thing and then toss it back, and maybe we'll talk about this stuff more later. One other thing we did intentionally, and this goes specifically to the question, could you do it today? Because we were sort of an indie, the equivalent of an indie film company, we were a little more artsy and not only driven by commercial success. We certainly wanted to make games that people liked and bought, but we also wanted to make stuff that we thought and that people thought was innovative and pushed the edge of the envelope and the intersection of technology, creativity, storytelling, graphics, animation, all those dimensions. And so we developed a culture that was extraordinarily collaborative. And as Peter said, we almost never, even though we tried to make our deadlines, we almost never sacrificed funativity, which was our joking way of saying, is the game any fun, for a ship date. And we gave ourselves permission to do that because we always figured that if we knew a better way to do it, and at a certain point we had to push it out the door, but if we knew a better way to do it, or if they knew a better way to do it, it was worth trying to figure out whether we could actually make it better, make it more fun, make it more engaging. And we gave ourselves permission to do that for quite a long time. So.
Thanks, Steve. And I'll say Steve would often ask us, what's the funativity quotient, of a concept that was running by. One of the slides you may see that we'll be hitting later shows that we had many concepts that we never actually put into production, just throwing ideas out, discussing them. And I have since come to realize that part of what Steve was getting us to do was think about what now is thought of as metrics and is very routine. But at the time, even thinking, would this be fun, was slightly radical. It was more a matter of, hey, am I having fun making this? And well, we'll just throw it out there and see what happens. But trying to see if there was some way of measuring that was a new thing. So you saw a bit of Habitat in action. That was a really groundbreaking, unusual thing at the time. You have to realize these were, Commodore 64s, running at 1 megahertz, clock speed. Yes, 1 megahertz, and with 300 baud modems, which is just incredibly slow data rates. And yet, our next speaker, Chip Morningstar, who also looks slightly different, some of us have changed slightly. He came in as our tools programmer originally, but had this great idea, and I'd like Chip to talk a little bit about, some of the pressures he felt with that, and what was going on when he came up with this idea of radical idea. In fact, Chip, if you look online, is one of the people who had to coin the term avatar in its current sense, because up until then we never had to describe what this character is. It's not really you, but you kind of control him, but it was a radical new concept at the time. So Chip, tell us about it.
Well, I mean, you start out talking about the Commodore 64, and it's kind of like, these old things about, well, I had to walk barefoot through the snow 18 miles, each way uphill in the dark, past bandits and mountain lions. Well, actually, the mountain lions part is true, but we actually had mountain lions at Skywalker. But the reality is we were attempting something kind of crazy, and we had sort of the freedom to do that because we had the Lucasfilm brand behind us, and there was just something to the glamour associated with Star Wars and the whole Lucasfilm universe that we were able to capitalize on quite shamelessly, and people would come to us just wanting to sort of bask in the reflected glory of Star Wars, and companies would be coming through all the time. And one of the things that happened is people in the group would come up with ideas and write them up, and Steve would keep a file full of this stuff. And when some company would come wandering through, Steve would pull a couple of ideas out of the idea file and see if he could sell them on kicking us some money to develop it. And so we ended up getting, and what's sort of one of the rules we operated in is sort of a corollary of that stay small, be the best, and don't lose any money. Principle was we kind of never did anything with the company's own money. We always had to get somebody else to pay for it. And so we ended up getting very creative in some of the deals we made. And one of them was a company called Quantum Link, which was doing a consumer-oriented online service for owners of Commodore 64 computers. And they had just had a big strategic investment from Commodore International, and they were looking around for, well, what can we do with this service that we've got? They had some interesting things they'd done to bring the cost down quite radically. And so I had this project proposal that I cooked up in conversation with Noah actually originally started out, we were discussing AI. And I said, well, you know, we don't know how to create an automaton which is as rich and exciting and interesting and smart as a real human being. So what if we just actually connected you to other real human beings? And it kind of went from there. And so the guy from Commodore comes in, and Steve pulls this proposal out of the file cabinet, and lo and behold, the guy's excited, and discussions, negotiations start. Several months later, we have a deal, and off we're going. And now all of a sudden, oh, you have to actually produce this thing. And since it was my idea, there we go. And then one of the things that's interesting about the group is it was kind of radically egalitarian in that sense. That everybody had kind of the title structure was flat. You know, all of the developers, their title was designer/programmer, except for Gary, who was artist/designer or something like that. Everybody was entitled to contribute, and so even though I was the tools guy, I was just as much in the mix of the creative discussions as anybody else was. And so when this project got the green light, there I was, and now I started to get learn by fire advanced training in project management, and ended up doing a whole bunch of stuff that looking back on it, it was kind of like, what were we thinking? But in fact, ended up inventing a bunch of really interesting distributed systems technology that I continue to make use of to this day. I'm now on like the 8th generation server, but it's all based on the same fundamental architecture. Just doing crazy stuff on a Commodore 64, like demand-paged object-oriented virtual memory off of a floppy disk. You know, real-time packet switch data communications over a 300 baud modem. And all of that stuff, and you'd look at that stuff now and you say, you know, you can't do that. And we didn't know you couldn't do that, so we just went and did it, and it worked. And there's a lot to be said for just pushing the envelope.
Hear, hear. Well put. And following from that, you know, part of that egalitarian thing and all of us sharing ideas, there was a point, and I'll let Ron delve into it, but he was talking to Chip about creating languages and, you know, what could be done to, we were very interested, having been attracted to Lucasfilm because of Star Wars for the most part, and of course Indiana Jones was quite big and fresh, still coming out with new movies then. And we were very interested in doing interactive storytelling, and Ron had some ideas about that led to what is now infamous as SCUM, the script creation utility for Maniac Mansion. And Maniac Mansion, Ron did a great postmortem on that at a previous GDC, but maybe you can tell us a little bit more about what happened with his development of that and how he was given some freedom to explore what was next in interactive storytelling.
Yeah, I think you know, my biggest memory from developing you know, the SCUM system for Maniac Mansion was what felt like to me at the time was almost getting fired by Steve, because you know, Gary and I had worked on Noah's game Koronis Rift. I was hired to do the port from the Atari 800 to the Commodore 64. And while I was doing that, I befriended Gary Winnick, who's on the left or right, can't tell which side. And we, you know, came up with this idea for this game called Maniac Mansion, mostly because we liked, you know, B horror movies. And so we started working on it, and I think we'd probably worked on it for maybe 9 months. And Gary and I had a design, and the code was going nowhere, because, you know, I was trying to code the entire thing in 6502 assembly language, which really was not working. And I remember at some point, Steve called me into his office, and I remember we had a talking to, kind of about the state of the game and how it was not progressing very far. And I also think this is the point that David Fox was brought onto the project as a scripter, and I think that's because Steve felt that the project needed an adult on it, which was the other thing. But as I was, kind of fumbling around with the 6502 stuff, I was talking to Chip, and Chip had suggested, well, why don't you do like a scripting language, and we'll build a compiler and an interpreter, and I mean, all this seemed crazy to me on a Commodore 64, to write all this stuff. But Chip actually convinced me that this would be doable, and I think Chip went off and wrote the first compiler over lunch, which was very impressive.
It took a couple of days.
A couple of days. And really from that, came this whole adventure game scripting language, which, obviously went on to, power most of the Lucasfilm adventures, Maniac Mansion, Zak McKracken, and Monkey Island, and Sam & Max, and all of those games. But, I think, as other people have mentioned, I think it was that environment we had, which was very collaborative, and everybody worked together. And there was this kind of sense, well, except for me worried about getting fired, there was this there wasn't this fear of failure at some levels, and it really kind of allowed you to go off and do really interesting things. And as Chip had mentioned, I think a lot of the stuff we did, we were just kind of too stupid to know that it couldn't be done, and so we would just kind of go and do all of these really interesting things.
Yep. Well, I've got a little bit of animation from Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade that David and Ron and I led together, just to give you a sense of what that was like for those you in the audience who haven't seen some of this. Sorry about the sound level there. Solving a puzzle with scum. Does anybody remember why you needed to do that?
In order to have a puzzle.
I guess so. Okay, so I think we're going to go through a little, who's that handsome guy on the right? Boy, I figured I'd better humiliate myself as long as I've been doing it to everybody else on the team.
What's that stuff on the top of your head?
Yeah. I got it. Oh, I've been replacing it with hardware. It's actually much easier to groom. And also a nod to Eric Wilmunder in the middle there, who was also instrumental in Habitat, but came in on the Koronis Rift team early on, as Ron did. So I'm going to let this run through a bunch of slides now as we talk about some of the other issues that have come up. And this, as I expected, we've taken a little longer than I thought we would, but we're going to leave some time for Q&A. So if people have really burning questions, we've got some microphones out there, and I'm going to ask the panel a question or two, but if I start to see people accumulating there, I'll turn it over to you guys. So feel free to stand up by the microphones, and in a few minutes we'll get to that. One of the questions, though, I wanted to throw out to the panel, anybody want to jump up on this, is George himself, as you've heard, was directly involved, although really let us experiment quite a bit, both in the ways you've heard and also in the fact that he spent probably a total of, 2 or 3 hours every year working with our group directly, which we felt neglected at the time, and yet, as with the Star Wars thing, in retrospect, I think maybe there was a benefit to that, because he didn't impose any vision on us. As Steve mentioned, we were really lucky in the company of being able to be creative people with the name Lucasfilm stamped on what we did, and not have it come directly from George. But does anybody else have any thoughts on that, of what he was doing and how it worked for us?
Well, one of the things I noticed was, and I really only became more aware of this after the fact, is because we weren't allowed to touch any of the Lucasfilm properties initially, Star Wars, Indiana Jones, any of those, which the company viewed as money in the bank, because they could turn around and license those for top dollar to other game companies and take the licensing fee and not take any of the risk. we were kind of forced by default to do our own creative stuff on our own, which unbeknownst to me at the time turned out to be the source of a lot of jealousy in other parts of the company, because here we were getting to create our own stuff, and all these other really creative, really capable people were forced to march to George's vision.
Any other thoughts about that?
Yeah, when we later spent some time with LucasArts, I recognized a real difference in the feel of the company, in that they were now constrained by scripts other people had written, and had to make games that they had some creative input to, but for the most part, the general arc was all determined for them ahead of time, and I think that took a lot of the fire out of it. I was really glad. I was conscious at the time that this was a boon to us, that we could watch what, say, Atari was doing with the licensed things, and even make comments like, "This isn't good enough. Princess Leia is ugly in this and needs to be prettier," or whatever. But we didn't have to write those scripts ourselves. So.
I think one of my earliest, first memory actually of meeting George Lucas was, this was right after the 10th anniversary of Star Wars, and George and Steven Spielberg had shaved off their beards so they could sneak into a showing of the Star Wars thing and not be noticed. And that was so the first time that I met George, I met a George Lucas without a beard, and I really kind of felt ripped off, because I wasn't meeting that iconic George Lucas with a beard. So I think that will stick with me.
So yeah, see, it all comes down to facial hair, I guess, in the end. So something I'd like to ask, and I think I'd like to start with you, Steve, since you've been somebody who's been hearing a lot of pitches, that I just wonder whether the factors that kind of aligned for us, does it feel to you that was unique and a chance, or do you think that could be sort of engineered in company pitches and startups today? Do you think that kind of feeling could be recreated?
It's an interesting question. One of my experiences since Lucasfilm Games was I was in the venture capital business for a long time. So that's the context that Noah's asking about in terms of thinking about dynamics of startups. And I think one of the benefits we had, which is what I said earlier about the notion that we got to adopt this indie spirit. We got to push ourselves to figure out what was interesting or what was fun or what was creative. And the business context gave us permission to do that. And I guess one of the questions I would have for the companies of today is whether or not those room for that kind of innovation, try something new rather than do something bigger, harder, faster that we've already done a bunch of times, if that is something that people are willing to allow. There is a significant amount of innovation in the game business today, but there's also a significant amount of repetition, replication of models that have been tried and true. And so if there was one window that I think we gave ourselves, it was the chance to try something new. Who knew you couldn't do communication on 300 baud modems, right? We said, well, what the heck, let's try it. And we did, as Chip said, convince somebody else to pay for it. So in that sense, it had a little bit of that startup mentality. We pitched. We basically had to pitch these ideas, either to an Atari to fund us or to a Commodore or somebody else. But in the context of that, there was the chance to say, we think we can do this. We actually don't know if we can do it, but if we could, it would be worth it. So I guess that might be a way to think about whether that spirit exists someplace in, probably in indie studios that are innovating, and happily the cost to build stuff today, at least on some platforms, is substantially less than it was in our day, but on other platforms is hugely greater. I mean, we did our mega games for a few $100,000, and some of you guys are spending $25 million on a game today. I mean, that was completely unheard of.
Yeah.
What's that?
The cheap ones.
The cheap ones, exactly. I mean, that was completely unheard of. And so that was another constraint, I guess, that pushed us to try to figure out what all we could get done on a relatively constrained environment.
And David, you've been doing some Unity development recently, and in that same sense, do you think there's anything about those sort of old methods that could be applied to companies today or game development today?
Well, I think the big thing that we had there was was this support of the team, and I don't think that's really technology dependent. And people mentioned that a few times, like whenever we had a game concept, it would be passed around all the other game designers and plus other people who were kind of key people, and we'd meet and we'd talk and we'd give feedback, and some not as much thumbs up, thumbs down, but this is a great idea, this should go forward. And I haven't seen that much in other places where I've been where it was really a feeling of support of everyone. It wasn't if he gets his and I won't get mine. There wasn't that kind of competition. So a real sense. I mean, we don't go to lunch all the time at the ranch. We would just go to the main house and have lunch and talk, and that without that support from all the creative people who were there, I think what happened wouldn't have happened.
Yeah. Well,
let me just add one thing to that. Rumor. Some of you have heard the rumor that all of the first 10 Pixar movies were planned by the team in one afternoon, sitting over lunch or something, and then they sort of delivered them. But there was that sense of creative collaboration at Pixar that resulted in a very different spirit of creativity than what had been known up to that point in the movie business. And although we didn't do all of ours in one afternoon, we did something very similar, which was what David was talking about. It was a very collaborative process, and it wasn't a process of somebody else judging. It was somebody else making somebody else's idea better. It was every game is a Lucasfilm game. All of us do this. And so that, I think, allowed us to push not only storytelling and new models of, I mean, the Maniac Mansion interface, for example, probably looks clunky to you guys today, but in those days it was a massive innovation to be able to actually allow you to construct interesting ways to have characters do things using that kind of language-based interface. And a bunch of people contributed to that idea. Ron and his team actually built it, but it was something that everybody could pitch in on. And same thing happened with little bits of code. Somebody would write a 3D scaling algorithm for a character in one game, and then we'd be talking about it, and somebody would say, oh, well, we could probably retrofit that and fit it in over here. And all of a sudden, components of tools or development capacity is also being cross-fertilized among teams, so everybody had a sense of helping everybody's game be better.
There is, what I remember was not competition within the group, but I feel like we were competing with the rest of the company in a lot of ways. ILM with the film part, and one thing I really remember was going to one of the early consumer electronics shows, and I think this is when Rescue and BallBlazer were first being shown, and was walking around the floor, and someone was looking at our game and was really impressed and said, wow, this is really great, Lucasfilm Games. Is there anything else your company does? Yeah. And so it was the first time I felt like we were being judged on our games rather than comparing them to the films, and that was really nice.
No, I was with David at that time. It was just quite a revelation, just really, really nice to stand on our own that way.
And this was a good tit for tat for the time when I think some magazine said that this was the best graphics ever produced in a video game, and I believe Alvy Ray Smith said it's the worst graphics ever came out of Lucasfilm.
So you've been patient. I'm going to throw it open to the audience, and you've been standing for a long time. Thank you.
Thanks, Noah. Whoa, that's loud. Hey, I'm Alex Handy from the Museum of Art and Digital Entertainment. I just wanted to let everybody know you can play some of these games over at Moscone West. On the second floor, we have BallBlazer and Maniac Mansion, as well as the rest of your history. But I have questions for Chip, of course, who probably expected my questions. Chip, you have to cross-compile Habitat on the VOS server, right? So, did you guys start developing that on the C64, or did you start it on VOS? Because it seems kind of weird.
Well, the VOS was used for the server. The development environment for all of the Atari and Commodore and Apple, and basically all of the home computer games, was the host was a Unix system. various VAXs and Sun workstations and that sort of thing. In fact, the job that I was actually originally hired to do was to replace the macro assembler, because when I interviewed, they said, well, we have the world's most powerful 6502 macro assembler, but it's written in Lisp, and you know, and it requires 2 megabytes of memory on our half megabyte VAX, and so it's really slow. But you can use all of Lisp as your macro language, so it's really powerful. So we'd like you to replace it with a more traditional assembler, but oh, by the way, we don't want to give up any of the power. And so we did a lot of cross-compilation, cross-development stuff, but it was all things like Sun workstations with special hardware that let us reach into the memory of like the Commodore 64. We actually had a cartridge that plugged in and let you rewrite the memory on the fly and interrogate it and do all of this stuff from much more powerful Sun workstation, which was pretty radical for the time.
And I'll give another shout out to Alex's museum there. I was talking to him the other day, and they got an amazing amount of stuff up and running that I never would have believed was possible to do all these years later. It's kind of a computer archaeology that I think will be more and more important as time goes on.
Yeah, he mentioned VOS. I think they're actually trying to get Habitat running again, which if they can pull it off, well, I'll just be
We're working on it.
awesomely impressed.
The thing that, let me just add one more tidbit. The thing that killed Habitat actually was it was too popular. The deal that we had with Quantum Link, which became America Online, was that they ran the back-end servers and Chip and his team created the front end. And they just had a handful of a relatively small number of people playing the game when it was first in beta test, the first multiplayer online game. And the fact of the matter is, with this small handful of people, relatively speaking, it was driving so much volume on their system that they actually had to shut it down, because at $3.60 an hour, which is what the cost used to be per hour for premium services on America Online, they couldn't make any money. So it actually was never brought out commercially, in spite of the fact that it had all those innovations.
Yeah, I'm not actually sure that that's strictly speaking true, because they were struggling with how do you market this thing? Because it was so strange, and they didn't have the vocabulary to talk about it. And so they were constantly struggling to figure out, how do we explain this to people?
I agree with him. They didn't know how to talk about it either.
And as a result, there was always a faction at Q-Link that said, we don't want to deal with this because we don't know how.
Next question.
Hi, I'm John Walker from Rock Paper Shotgun. First of all, I just want to say thank you for so much of my childhood. I wanted to ask, one of my fondest memories, I would be looking through the manuals and there would be that line in there that said, there's this little sly dig at Sierra, that our games won't kill you, and these statements. So I was wondering if you could talk maybe about how the competition with Sierra inspired your games, and whether they influenced you, or whether there was any sort of arms race between the two of you.
It's a great question. Anybody want to jump in on that?
Yeah, you know, with the adventure games specifically, we were in this intense competition
I don't
with
think
Sierra.
they knew we were in a competition.
And I think, well, okay. And I think most of it was just that they sold so much better than we did. I mean, King's Quest sold maybe 10 times, you know, what Maniac Mansion did. And so there was always this kind of competition to, you know, do better than them. But I mean, it was all very friendly. We actually had a baseball game with them. When we worked up at Skywalker Ranch, there was a softball field, and so we invited Sierra to come up, and, you know, we had a friendly softball game one Saturday, which they won. I'm not bitter or anything. But yeah, I think their success, you know, at least for the groups doing the adventure games, their success really drove us to try to do better.
I think that maybe the distribution wasn't as good in Europe, but in Europe, our games did way better than theirs did, apparently.
Yeah, and thank you, Germany in particular,
Yes.
where our sales rates were literally 10 to 1 per capita. What they were in the US is quite amazing.
Yeah, the whole line, I'm famous in Japan, is actually true.
You know, I brought Ron out to Germany, and people were showing him tattoos of Maniac Mansion that they put on their bodies, or Monkey Island, I guess. Yes, next question.
Hey. Apologies for this being a little bit of a story, but it's like 3 sentences. It's 2004. In an early virtual world, I've met this girl online, and I'm chatting to her on AOL Instant Messenger. Monkey Island comes up, and there's a pause as we both type. The 2 messages come at the same time, and it's, you fight like a dairy farmer, how appropriate you fight like a cow. And I like to think that's how we knew. Subsequently moved out to California. We've been happily married for 2 years, so.
All right.
Congratulations.
Thank you for changing lives in small and big ways. If I have a question, it's really about the adventure gaming genre and whether it worked best in the sort of low fidelity kind of 8, 16, 32-bit sort of, growing medium, and a bit like kind of, humor in particular seems to work incredibly well in things like South Park, maybe even more so than in even higher fidelity zones like Family Guy, etc. How do you think with very high fidelity media like, full 3D engines, Unreal, 4 running in the browser, you can get humor across in the medium best? And that's to anyone who wants to talk on that.
I think Ron has to at least say something about that.
I think humor, humor in adventure games is really important, because if you really think about an adventure game, you're doing completely ridiculous things. And it helps if you can kind of poke fun at those things. If you're doing a game that's a comedy, you can have a rubber chicken with a pulley in the middle, and nobody really questions that at some degree. Where if you're doing a really serious game and you have something strange, there's a suspension of disbelief that's kind of lost. And I think that goes a little bit back to the fidelity issue. Is since you are doing these strange things, I think if you have a lower fidelity, more cartoonish, you can kind of get that stuff across more. And we really don't have the technology to do this ultra realism right now without hitting that uncanny valley thing. So that's why I personally enjoy art that's a lot more stylized, not necessarily cartoony, but stylized.
And I've got to throw in, I have a very fond memory of that very brainstorming session. I had so much fun in our brainstorming sessions, but we were talking about Monkey Island and talking about how are you going to get Guybrush to go down there, and we said, we could slide on a rope, and we were saying, well, we need something to hook over the rope so he doesn't burn his hands. And somebody said, what about a rubber chicken? And we had a very serious discussion about the fact, but a rubber chicken, the rubber will catch on the rope and you won't really be able to slide, and would that be funny? Could we do something? And I guess it just won't work. And honestly, I don't remember who even said this, but somebody popped up and said, well, what about a rubber chicken with a pulley in the middle? And we just cracked up and, bang, it was in the game at that moment. But it was always one of my favorite brainstorming moments. I think we have time for just one more question.
Hi. Ramin from Halfbrick. First of all, thanks so much for the inspiration. As a French kid, I had to learn English just to play your games, and that was great. I want to ask you if you were doing the company again nowadays, would you do it different? Would you try to create crazy new epic technology? Would you try to go procedural MMO crazy thing? Or would you just take today's tools and create what you want?
Do you have $8 million?
Pardon?
That's it. I was just going to ask, do you have $8 million? We can answer that question for you.
The question was, would we do anything different? Would we still try all the crazy stuff?
More crazy stuff.
It would have to be more crazy now.
Yeah. No, I think we're in agreement on that. That this is an amazing time, more technology, I think, than we've ever seen before, and it just gives you more range to try stuff absolutely bizarre, and as Chip says, things that everyone is sure can't possibly work, because that's where all the cool stuff shows up. So I'm going to call it at that. Thank you very much for attending, and thanks to the panel here.